for me,
Ah,
but I'd be happy to do that. Yeah.
okay. All right. Yeah. So it might require a time change. I'll have to look into that a bit. Um, yeah, my guess is I don't know. There's a lot to be figured out. And it probably would not continue over the summer in any case. We would take a break during the summer and would start sometime in the fall. High holidays are late this year. Maybe we would start before the high holidays, sometime after Labor Day, maybe. So I'll have to see. But okay. All right. Well, I'll continue uh, discussing it with the relevant folks um, and let y'all know when I'm able to let y'all know.
Great. Sure.
All right. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Zoom like reconfigured its stuff here, so I have to like look for things now. All right. We're continuing with with the verses after Noah gets off the ark, in which Noah offers sacrifices, and then God um, says, after Noah offers the sacrifices, God says, to his heart, or maybe like to himself or something like that, or his sort of inner monologue. I don't know. That I will never again curse the earth on account of humanity, because the designs of the heart of humanity are evil from his youth. Um, and I will no longer smite all life as I have done. Um, okay, so we mentioned a few of the questions I think engendered by those verses. First of all, why is God saying it to himself? What was it about the sacrifice that made God say this, or prompted God to say this? Is it a critique of the sacrifice? Is it an acceptance of the sacrifice? Was God, you know, was the jury still out for God, that maybe God was going to destroy the world again, and then God decided not to because of the sacrifices? We also this is a parallel statement to something that God makes before the flood. That the designs of the heart of man are only evil all day long. So there are a number of questions that these verses raise. We've talked about some parts of this passage, in particular Noah's sacrifice, the idea that it was a reach nichoach, a sweet smell, pleasing smell. Okay, now we're getting to the statement that God makes. Okay, before we do that, let's just say, oh, sorry, yeah, Eric.
Oh, go ahead. I'll try, say what you were going to say before we do that.
Oh, I was just going to start with a blessing, but you want to ask a question about that intro
Yeah,
first?
I'll do the blessing and then I'll do the question.
Okay. All right. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay.
Great.
All right, Eric, you want to start us off with the
Well, it
question?
was just I was reading in Robert Alter and his take on the idea of the aroma was that for the redactors, I guess you'd say, the point was to distinguish this response to sacrifice with what was typical in many other ancient religions at the time, which had sacrifices for the gods in which the sacrifice was understood to actually feed the gods. And there were some passages where the gods were said to descend like ravenous flies on the
Yeah.
sacrifice, right? And eat them. And so he thinks maybe the reason we just get the aroma thing is to say, we're not like that. This is not feeding God. This is just, but it did seem the aroma was, the pleasing aroma reached God anyway, whether he was pleased with it or not. So.
Hmm. I think I made mention at one point in the past few weeks of this line in The Simpsons
Yes.
where where Lisa is upset that some, kind of like I don't know, maybe they didn't make turkey on Thanksgiving or something like that. I don't know. And Homer says, "What do you care? You're a vegetarian." And she says, "Yeah, but I appreciate the smell."
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, right. So God's not eating it, but God appreciates the smell. That's, it's and I think that is definitely a pretty um, common view among biblical scholars, that this is a direct commentary, or direct reference to those ancient mythologies, that seek to kind of demythologize the story a little bit. Yeah, it still remains to me not quite clear whether God actually feels positively about this sacrifice,
Mhm.
right? Regardless of whether or not God eats it. It's a question of whether, how we should read that, that pleasing aroma phrase, especially in light of what comes next, which we're going to be looking at. But yeah, I think that alters expressing something that is a pretty common take among biblical scholars, about um, what the Bible does um, with other ancient Near Eastern mythologies and cultic practices
Have
and
we
theologies that underlie those cultic practices.
have we decided why Noah is doing this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I I guess there are uh, th three possible answers, right? One is, um, it was, the way people expressed, gratitude, thanksgiving to the gods, or to, to deities in the ancient world, and so what Noah, um, that's what Noah knew how to do. Um, and I guess I said three, but they're really kind of all related to that, which is, number one, he assumed that it was what God wanted. Um,
Why
uh,
would God want it?
that he assumed, like, God doesn't command him to do it, right?
Right.
So he assumed that it's what God wanted. And we actually encountered that in the Midrash, that he, I think we did anyway, that he assumed that because God only sent, told him to take on um, one male and one female of the non-kosher animals, but seven pairs of the kosher animals. That what God intended there was for some of them to be expendable, right, and to be used for sacrifice. Anyway, so that's one possibility, is that Noah assumed that that's what God wanted, even though God didn't command him directly. And another is, I guess it's also related, right? Is that this is just what's done in circumstances like that.
But why is it done?
I,
Let's go back to Cain and Abel. I don't think God commands them to sacrifice.
no,
He does not. But he's clearly dissatisfied with Cain's sacrifice.
yes. I think what the Torah is pointing to there is that there is something primal about the desire to bring sacrifice. Um, I'm not a, an anthropologist. So I think that that's really a question for anthropology, about, what is it? And do we still have that impulse or that inclination, even though we don't do sacrifices in the same way nowadays? Some of you know Danny Kraft, a member of the congregation. He gave a really powerful Devar Torah back in want to say it was like in November, on Parshat Va'era, which has the story of the binding of Isaac. And I was, several weeks into the war in Gaza, and he talked about the the impulse for child sacrifice, as something that is, uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Like an inherent part of the human condition, and that the Torah, the Torah represents something there, that we recoil at, but Abraham doesn't. And part of the question of or part of the a way of thinking about Abraham's lack of objection or recoiling to what God instructs him for there is that Abraham might say to himself, like, of course God would want this, right? Like, this is what people do. I'm surprised that God hadn't asked me before this, right? To do that. What Danny is saying is that that we still sacrifice our children. We just do it in different ways. And I thought that was a really provocative and powerful point.
Well, I would add to that whenever there's a sacrifice for anything, the sacrifice is something which is important, valuable, or precious to the one making the sacrifice. A child, for example, the extreme. But just food with the aroma is something that is precious to that particular person making the sacrifice.
Right.
And notice too that the sacrifices are to be of the best, the unblemished. Anyone that's been around domesticated animals, farm animals, will know that those who raise them become very proud of their bloodlines and so on and so forth. Yeah. And but those are the kinds of animals that should be offered for sacrifice.
Right, and they're very valuable too.
Exactly.
Not only as a matter of pride, but also just as a matter of the financial interest that they represent. And though the Torah kind of institutes a system in which if you can't afford X, you can bring Y instead, but still proportionally, we're talking about someone being asked to give up something of value to them. And I think that's right. I think that's one way of thinking about sacrifices, and that may be the impulse to it, or at least the logic behind it, is that that you show your devotion by giving up something precious. Right, and the more precious the thing is you give up, the more you're devoted.
Right, but the question then here is, of course, or rather the difference is that we are not to sacrifice our children. That's a recurrent theme, and yet we continue to do it. This is the World War I, there was I can't remember which poet it was, in any case, represented the sacrifice of his English generation as something performed like Abraham slaying Isaac. And indeed, these are certainly the truisms. The old send the young out to die. And they do it over and over again. And it's always in the name of something. But it's clearly it's not in the name of our God, even though that may be the claim.
Well, right. I think that's right. I mean, I think that all too often is the claim. And it's think that you're right, good sensitive reading of the Torah is that, no form of child sacrifice is acceptable, whether it's, literally on the altar, or it's on the metaphorical altar, of high ideals, even the ones that we think are, divine ideals,
Right.
because those are incompatible with one another. But the idea behind it, right? The point, I guess, that was coming from what Joe is saying is that, child sacrifice is on some level, could be understood as the highest form of expression, right? If the idea of sacrifice is you're giving up, you're showing your devotion by giving up something precious, right? Then the most precious thing to you, maybe your child that you're willing to give up, shows just how devoted you are. There's an additional aspect of it. I mean, I read, I think I mentioned this a couple of weeks ago. I was reading a book called The Savage Judaism, or The Savage in Judaism, or something like that. It's also an anthropological interpretation of the Bible. And the author, whose name I can't remember now, argued that the sacrificial system is totemic, that it's, meant to be a metaphor for the person bringing the offering, right? So it's expressing, the total devotion of the individual, the willingness of the individual to give themselves to the divine, or to the deity, and you're sort of representing that through an animal that symbolizes you, or some other, kind of offering that symbolizes you. And that reflects what Heschel once said, that it's customary to say that prayer replaced sacrifices, but Heschel says that that's not true, that prayer is the sacrifice. And that what he argues that we're doing in prayer is just, what the word is the substitution for the animal, but the intention behind it, right, is that we are sort of like metaphorically laying ourselves on the altar, but we should bring the totality of our being to the act of worship.
Well, I mean, so here we have returned to saying in your heart.
Right.
A form of thanksgiving.
But this is God saying it in God's heart.
Right.
Well, but look down at the commentary, and we have, the fool says in his heart there is no God, which is actually, that psalm is twice. That's also Psalm 54.
Hmm.
So one might argue that the difference between God accepting this in his heart and the human heart, which is evil from which is evil from day one, is the decision, or the willingness to not make a sacrifice, a living sacrifice,
Well,
to not satisfy one's the bloodlust, bloodthirstiness. I mean, certainly, I look around me today and I see plenty of bloodthirsty leaders who are in the process of denying their own death by sending many others to their death.
I think you can't get around how important blood and killing is to the whole sacrificial idea, especially anthropologically speaking, right? We began as hunter-gatherers eons ago, right? Hunter-gatherers with an emphasis on hunters. Life was a daily struggle involving killing and blood and getting bloody, right? It was violent. And part of the ritual practice, for whatever reason, meant offering some of that to the gods who were said to protect us. It's hard to know what that meant to them. But that daily practice, right, was part of human culture for thousands of years.
And fire came later.
Sorry?
And fire came later.
And fire, okay, yes, fire, that's true. Fire came later. And the evolution, that's the right word, of sacrifice into prayer is enormously sophisticated. But we haven't really done whatever I think we need to do with this human propensity to violence, right? Because it keeps coming back, right? As Larry says, right? Has there ever been a generation that hasn't gone to war? Right? I mean, we see it everywhere, and we see it internally in our cities. We see it everywhere you look. So there's something I don't really know where I'm going with this, except to say that I think there's something we don't really understand about blood sacrifice. That it was once a part of our daily ritual, and maybe, well, no, I think it'd be too easy to say that took care of something for us, because those were violent times intrahumanly as well. But yeah, it's a strange and deeply archaic thing, and the need for violence is still with us.
To leap a little bit ahead in Noah, also, Noah, instead of killing Ham, curses him. That's a step forward.
Right.
Hmm.
Well, not all sacrifices involve blood, though. You can sacrifice grain, cereals.
That was part of what I would call the evolution. Yes, as we domesticated agriculture. Yeah.
I'd also like to point out too, from what Larry, the verse does not say that man is evil. It says the Soncino says, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, his imagination.
Yeah.
I'm having a problem with the word imagination.
Yeah, the Hebrew term there is yetzer, like the inclination, I think is
inclination,
more,
right?
is the more common translation.
Which implies, of course, that he can turn away from evil.
Yeah,
he can turn away from it.
right. That's right.
He's not per se evil.
But it is, I think it is, that's why I keep on coming back to this. Like I just wonder about God's reaction to this sacrifice in saying that, human beings are inclined toward evil. Is God, is that a statement of appeasement, right? That God's not gonna, God sees the sacrifice is sated and says, actually they're inclined toward evil, but like I'm not gonna hurt them again. Or is it like resignation, right? Is the act of the sacrifice, to Eric's point, is it revealing something about humanity to God, right? That Noah wasn't commanded to kill an animal when he got off the ark. He was commanded to protect the animals. And to underscore the point, like, if sacrifice is about, giving up something that's precious to you, like these animals didn't belong to Noah. Right. And so like his first instinct in getting off the boat, that may be the sense of like the inclination of his heart. Like the first instinct he has is to kill something. And God saying, like, oh, man, like I guess I was wrong about the humanity. Like maybe they are on some level ultimately irredeemable. But that's not an excuse for wiping them out, right? Because like I couldn't wipe them out and start again, because starting again would just be as bad as it was before. So I don't know, but I think, Eric, your point is right. I mean, I do hear there are a lot of commentators that talk about sacrifice being an intention intended to sublimate the human propensity to violence, and channel it into something that is more regulated and more, I don't know, constructive, I guess you could say, right? But the problem with that argument is that if that's the intention, it doesn't really work.
No, not at all.
Right, because people are just as violent when they have sacrifices as when they didn't.
Christianity tried that big time, right? The ultimate,
yeah, right.
right? And maybe this will be it, right? But no, far from it in that example.
I think the verse is what we've bantered around for some time, the free will of man. And I think that this verse is evidence that, biblically speaking, human beings have choices. They're not just a bunch of automata
Right.
programmed to act a certain way. They can make choices.
No, I love that. That's a very sensitive reading of that phrase. That we have, the inclination to evil.
Exactly.
And by the way, it doesn't say from birth, which is also interesting, right? It says from youth.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because recently I've wondered about that very point there. Not from birth, but from youth. Of course, at birth you're young, but it seems to have another.
Well, right, but like on some level, what
What's
it's
the
saying is
Hebrew,
that the inclination to evil is learned and not inherent, or acquired and not inherent.
Or perhaps,
Exactly. Yes. Yeah.
perhaps it's developmental.
Development, yeah.
Because, because hormonally we change 5, 6, 7 years old, what up till then, what was Freud call it the, I can't remember, but in any case, basically it's the time when there's peace in the jungle, because you haven't yet become another one of the beasts.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, my like
Fifth
thinking about my
grade, sixth grade, that's when it starts to change.
5th grade.
I don't know, both of my kids, when they were 3 years old and went outside in the street, first time they saw an ant, they both stomped right on it. It's just like, wow.
Oh, wow. Little tyrants.
Yeah, toddlers. Oh,
Yeah, right. But that's where I would peg it, right? Sometime in the toddler years.
mine. Yeah.
Right. So that is, I mean, if you think about it developmentally, I think that there is something to be said for that, right? That the that evil is probably best understood as selfishness. And there could be a way in which selfishness is not always directed toward evil. But that's like that I think is maybe the impulse that it's talking about, which you really do start developing in the toddler years, because it's really in those years that you start to differentiate, have a sense of yourself as differentiated from everything else around you, right? And so there is a preoccupation with like what is mine, right, and what is other people's, or what is me and what is not me, right?
Yeah. Boundary, yeah.
I see it as a corollary to pride.
Mm-hmm.
Why would a small child step on an ant? Assuming that, Eric, are you saying this is the first time the child encountered an ant?
Well, pretty much,
Yeah, yeah. And now, why would a child do that? Was he trying to stop the ant from moving? I doubt he would have stamped on it or even noticed it if the ant had been still.
Probably true, yeah.
So he's bigger than the ant, and he has the power to stop that moving thing from moving.
Or this might be the moment he learns.
Exactly. Well,
right. So it's about testing the limits of your power.
I'm sorry?
It's about testing the limits of your power, or the extent of your power.
Yes. Animals in the wild will not take on an animal that is bigger than they are.
Except for the honey badger.
Well, which makes them famous.
You don't care.
For the mongoose.
Yeah, take it to an absurd point. A 3-year-old child wouldn't have the impulse to step on an elephant, even if it could.
Right. Yeah.
The sheer size, if nothing else, would deter certain predators.
Right, and that's right. I mean, you know, part of what explains my 6-year-old's different behavior at home than you know, with similarly aged peers or other adults outside of home, right? Everybody say, you know, he's a perfect angel everywhere else, right? Is sort of learned fear, right? That, you know, it's the same kind of dynamic that, like, I'm not going to attack somebody bigger than me because I don't know what will happen to me if I do. But when I'm at home, I know I can, you know, step on daddy's toes because daddy's not going to kill me. Daddy's not going to squish me.
Really?
You
But he's
know,
probably not intending
I
to
come,
That sounds like you've got the
they're very
impulse.
close sometimes.
he's probably not intending to hurt daddy in any case.
Right. No, but that's also true, right? But it's also a recognition that, like, that he's safe to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or one might say at home, he knows his place in the scheme of things. Outside the home, he does not yet.
Right.
I wouldn't read too much about stepping on an ant. I mean, that you know, that's I don't think that's a moral awakening. I just think
Yeah. Right.
Well, there are sects in Eastern religions. I'm thinking particularly of India. I think the Jains,
Right.
who don't step on insects. I mean, they will brush away a pathway or a sidewalk, for example, before they walk on it, for fear that they may unknowingly crush an insect, another animal, another living thing.
Didn't we have an
Devout
earlier
Jain.
Midrash that told us not to step on ants, basically? King who stepped on an ant or something, or killed something and was then punished for a long time. I'm
I don't
trying to
remember
remember when. Forget which one it was.
Can a person shmush a spider on the Sabbath?
Technically speaking, no.
No.
Unless it is, I mean, I guess there are a couple of caveats I would make to that. Like, if it's a venomous spider that has the, you know, that you're in immediate danger of, you can. But otherwise, probably not. I mean, I guess the only other argument you can make is if, you know, the presence of a spider totally disrupts your ability to have an enjoyable and restful Sabbath.
Well, but in a sense, that's a defensive mechanism, self-defense, I'd call it.
Right. Yeah. Self-defense.
That or at least you fear that the spider is going to harm you in some way.
Right.
We don't like to live with vermin like that.
Right.
So now, what if it's not the Sabbath?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that there's anything that I can think of in Jewish law that says that you can't kill an insect, you know, or an arachnid in your home. I'm not sure. I think that you could argue, you know, so you're not allowed to inflict pain on animals. But I don't know if that's an argument to say that you can't kill them. It just means you can't, you know, torture them.
Well, that becomes somewhat problematic. There's a certain ritual to follow to slaughter animals for food.
Right, exactly.
So,
right. So the general legal understanding is that the method of Jewish slaughter, of kosher slaughter, is designed so as not to inflict pain on animals.
Well,
or unnecessary.
As much as that is possible, I don't think they're slitting the throat of an animal for that second that it's slit.
Yeah, right.
Comfortable to it.
Probably not.
Yeah.
It's conceivable. I mean, what people argue is that it's, you know, you may not always realize that you get a paper cut at the time that you get the paper cut. And so there are arguments that I've heard that that the method of kosher slaughter is akin to that like by the time the animal has an opportunity to register the pain, it's already dead. Anyway, but the point is well taken. The other thing I would say is you're not allowed to waste things, right? Again, it's about like whether it's has a tangible benefit for you as a person, then you might be allowed to. But if it's just just walking down the street and squishing ants for the fun of it, you probably are not allowed to do that. And I think that the what I can think of more than that is the sort of like not the legal requirements, but the kind of like ethical impulse of the tradition would be to say, everything that God created for a purpose. Humans aren't the most important creatures on earth, right? And the Midrash says at one point, if anybody ever starts to think that, they should be reminded, the mosquito was created before you.
Hmm.
So
I wouldn't go that far. I mean, there's the early Genesis chapters, God makes man in his own image and likeness. That is not said about any other living being.
yes, I agree with that. But anyway, the Midrash has a different opinion about it, which is to say that that it's not that the creation is not in ascending order on some level; it's in descending order. That's one view within the tradition, right? The tradition is multivocal, but it is certainly a view represented within the tradition. And maybe the idea of human beings being created in God's image is not necessarily an expression of God's preference for human beings, but rather, I guess one of two things that's kind of unrelated to that. One is the responsibility of human beings, a comment about the responsibility of human beings. And the second is a comment about the distinctiveness of every individual human being. That's how the rabbinic tradition understands that, right? That every ant is exactly the same. But so far from the human perspective, every ant is the same. But every human being is different, which reflects a God that has no specific image. So to say that we're creating God's image means that God is all of our image.
Well, I mean, as for every ant being the same, first of all, it's hard to take a census. But why would one assume that every ant is the same? There are no two snowflakes the same.
Right. No, it's true.
So, I mean, and that is in fact far more compelling than the notion
Only animals
of
have
a universal die press that's stamping out, ants on an assembly line. That I mean, it may well be that I certainly cannot distinguish in a hill of ants between one and another, but certainly an entomologist can distinguish between between different roles of different ants in an anthill, and perhaps on some level can look at the individuals and see how they vary too. We tag animals in the sea to track them, and none of them are identical. It's
Well, but to underscore, like, why would we need to tag them if they weren't on some level, from our perspective, identical?
to track to see where they go,
Yeah, to see where they go.
to see how they behave. And look at anything closely and it becomes unique, just as you look at any word closely and it vanishes.
Man is the only animal that has intellect. I think we discussed this once before. There is nothing comparable to a human being in that respect.
As far as we know.
Well,
Well, that's
We-
all we
we can
can know,
imagine all
as
sorts
far
of
as we
things,
do.
but we have to
Well,
do
but,
it
but
the real
in other
world.
words, I don't know. I mean, how do you know that a whale doesn't have more intellect than you?
Show me a whale library.
Well,
Show
but
me
that
a
that's
whale
just a
creation of
that's
us.
just a mode of communication. So whales communicate differently. Maybe whales don't need a library
Yeah, they
because
can,
they have it
I
all
don't,
stored
I
in their
wouldn't
minds.
doubt that. I think animals can communicate. But
No, but it's just
communication is not
it's
intellection.
no, but it's the mode of communication and the physiology, right? So whales don't have opposable thumbs; they can't write. That doesn't necessarily mean that if the whale had that physiology, or that anatomy, that they wouldn't or couldn't, right? So we have a combination of a particular kind of intellect, and an anatomy that enables
I can
the expression of
daydream.
that intellect in a very particular kind of way.
I can daydream about any, a world where everything is perfect. I can take the word shalom, which I've seen once defined as, it still fascinates me now, as a state of being in which nothing desirable is lacking. That is an idea. That is, I'm imagining that. It's encapsulated in that word. Where's the communication there? I can sit back and just think of that. I'm not
I
communicating.
understand that, you said about a library, right? And
Yeah, a library
my
reflects
my
the
point.
ideas that are recorded.
Well,
By
that's fine, but that has more to do with our. But that has more to do with our mode of communication and our anatomy. What I'm saying is, how do you know that that an elephant doesn't daydream and have a vision of a
Well,
perfected
we have to
world?
look at what the evidence would be. And there's plenty of evidence of man's intellectual capacity. There is no evidence of the intellectual capacity. I'm not saying communication, for example, or language. There is no evidence of that with the chimpanzee. Show me a chimpanzee that's written a poem.
I think we're talking in circles about this. Um, uh, 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 what I'm trying
Show me a
to.
poet who eats a banana.
What's that?
Show me a poet who eats a banana.
So you say, so far as we know.
Yeah.
I hear so many people, especially in recent weeks, with the whole idea of eclipse, solar eclipse, and so on, and people who say, "Oh, there must be," there's no question about the fact that there are other civilizations and other intelligent beings elsewhere in the universe. It's always fascinating to me when scientists say this kind of thing, because there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that they exist. Now, if we had the empirical evidence, that would change many, many different things. That's a whole new ballgame. But there isn't any evidence of that.
Well, right, but an absence of evidence is not the same thing as an evidence of absence.
An evidence of absence. Let me comprehend that.
In other words, just because we don't have available evidence doesn't mean that it doesn't exist.
No, I agree. But we wouldn't act upon, would we act upon something that we know, to the best of our knowledge, does not exist?
Well, I mean, I guess what do you mean by act upon? Like what you're saying is that because
Would I look for a
hold on, is
by
the implication of what you're saying, Joe? Is the implication of what you're saying that because human beings have a higher order of intelligence than other creatures, that we, should be entitled, that our lives are worth more, that we should be entitled to do whatever we want with the rest of creation? Like, is that the implication of what you're talking about? Like, functionally, what does it matter?
I wouldn't go that far, but there's certainly, it's just about this time in Genesis that God permits human beings to consume animals.
Yeah, we haven't gotten there yet, but
Yeah, we haven't gotten there. It's coming up. What does that say?
Well, I don't know. Well, let's get to that Midrash and see what it says.
Yeah. Well,
I think that again, like there are arguments that the intention there is an accommodation to human violence. It's a permission to, not a requirement to, right? And the Torah, later on will qualify that in any number of different ways. God will qualify that in the Torah in any number of different ways. What kinds of animals you can eat, the fact that you can't, waste, you can't waste, you can't kill an animal for no purpose. So in other words, like you have to eat whatever you kill. You can't be wasteful about it. And on and on, right? So yes, there is permission given. But I mean, like you could say that there is permission given to lions to eat gazelles, and there's permission given to, right? It's and that.
do we have any evidence that God has communicated with other animals the way he's communicated with humans?
Well, hold on a second. Objection, Your Honor. What's the evidence that God has communicated to us?
The Torah.
That's evidence?
It's a written record.
It's a written record of a claim that God has spoken to us.
Okay, well now you're getting to the point.
It's not evidence that God has actually spoken.
Now you're getting to the area of where empirical evidence exists, and we're getting into faith. Okay, I'm not saying it's true, but we believe it's true.
Well,
why are we reading it?
Could I interject something here for a moment? It seems to me that part of what we're talking about is, from our hearts, one thing we do is to seek our likeness in other things, in other creatures, in other places. And insofar as my dog, which I no longer have, insofar as I look at my dog and I recognize him as a creature who responds to me and to whom I respond, and however I wish, Calvin was very smart. I would talk to him. He would do what I said to him. He could not only catch a ball, he could throw it. This part of, I mean, the search for a loved one, it's in part a desire to discover, to find some part of oneself in another, or some part of another that answers, that talks back, and to which we respond. Likewise, out there in space, are there other beings like us? That's what the question is. Or on Earth, how much like us are the other beings? And there isn't one answer, obviously, but there is one impulse to ask, and I think that's not even necessarily verbal. I mean it's an aspect of the human heart.
Right. I think that's what I was getting at, also, Joe, that to say that other animals don't have intelligence like human beings. I think that I would agree with you that animals don't have intelligence like human beings, but that
Rabbi, please let me correct you there. I'm not saying intelligence. I'm saying intellect.
Fine. What that's fine.
There is certainly
the same, but to me, it's the same
animals
difference.
Can be quite intelligent.
Animals don't have intellect like human beings. Presupposes a few things. One is that there is that our form of intellect is the only meaningful form of intellect, and the highest order of intellects that we have evidence for. And my point, I guess, is that that argument is kind of circular, because I'm certain a whale or an elephant, a chimpanzee, whatever, doesn't think like me, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have intellect.
Only suggest you check the dictionary for the definition of intellect.
Well, maybe instead of intellect, we could talk about self-consciousness, right? We are conscious. Animals are conscious of us and of their surroundings and of other animals. Dogs have a remarkable range of emotional responses to humans. We now know that animals like dolphins and whales and possibly elephants are closer to some kind of self-consciousness than we ever thought they were, but we don't yet have much evidence that they are aware that they are alive. Elephants will actually ponder's the wrong word. They will collect around a dead elephant for some number of minutes and
Well,
see.
they're ponderous.
Yeah, they're ponderous. They are. And realize that it's dead, right? But as far as we know, the vast majority of animals do not know that they're mortal, right? They have a fear of death, but they do not think about dying. They do not realize they are alive and are self-conscious and self-aware in the way that people are. They're intelligent in all kinds of ways. They can communicate. I heard a story about a chimpanzee who learned to play jazz piano, I mean, but, anyway, I think to me, it's more about self-consciousness and the awareness of your mortality than about communication or intelligence.
Right. But I think that you are pointing out, I think that there is good evidence that, certain high order mammals, aside from human beings, have that kind of consciousness.
Some of it, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. There was a really, there was a story from a few years ago about an orca named Tahlequah, that lost that had a calf that died, and carried around the dead calf
Yeah, I remember
for weeks.
Right.
And also, like, the other orcas in her pod also acted as though, we do when we're comforting mourners, right?
Yeah, no, that's true. So I think that area is blurry, but I still believe that there's a vast distance between that and where we are, though I don't think that gives us license to do anything in particular with regards to them in a moral sphere.
Okay, all right. We did not get very far today.
And throughout the universe, I don't know what you mean.
Yeah, well, right. We got very far in the philosophical conversation, not so far into the text. That's okay. Well, but I'm gonna have to stop there, unfortunately, for today. But we'll pick up and talk about human evil next week. Because that's the flip side, I guess, of this conversation, is we might have intellect, but maybe that also means that we have the capacity for evil in the way that other creatures don't as well.
Yeah, well, I would agree with that.
What's that?
I certainly agree with that.
Yeah, right. Okay, so next week we are on same usual time, usual place. And I'm going to be away this weekend, but hope you have a Shabbat Shalom. And if I don't see you beforehand, I'll see you next Thursday.
You're going to watch the eclipse?
I guess so. Might take step out and take a look at the shadow on the ground, I guess. Yeah. I'm not going to be I'm not going to be in the path of totality, though.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi.
All right, thanks, everybody.